Craig?
Yeah, I'm in a webinar.
Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning with this topic today, IHSA assigning and the Geographic Principle. Hope your new year and second half of your school year is off to a good start. We're going to run through this. Kurt Gibson is also here on the webinar, and if you have any questions, feel free to type those in, and we'll try to get those answered during the presentation or for sure at the end. And as always, if you ever have questions about anything, feel free to email us at the office. That's what we're here for. So we're going to talk about our process for assigning and the Geographic Principle that kind of guides us based upon policies, and we'll refer to a number of times throughout the presentation a couple different policies. But more than likely, if this hasn't happened to you, it's going to. The question here on this slide about how or why are we assigned in a particular regional, sectional, whatever the case might be. So we're going to talk through that this morning. So in terms of state series, we'll just kind of talk through, the different types of series we have. Of course, we have some one-class sports, and those are listed there where we don't really have a lot to do with the classification process related to it. And then the two-class sports you see identified there. And then obviously we have some three-class, some four-class, and some in football are 8 classes currently. And so we'll talk about each one of these, their classifications and their assigning as we go through the presentation. So the breakdown of our sport and their distinctions and we'll refer to these from time to time when we talk about the assigning process, as we have some individual team sports where the individuals guide really the assigning, though there are team awards in each of these that are based upon individual results. And then we have team bracketed sports where okay, somebody's not able to hear me. If others are having the same problem, please let me know. Yeah, but I'm going to continue with where we're at. So the team bracketed sports obviously are likely familiar with everyone, and the design of those are obviously we're putting them into brackets. Many start in a regional, proceed to a sectional, then to a super sectional, and then to a final. We'll have a slide to reference that. And then the team sports, these have added most recently are cheerleading and dance. So in terms of state series advancement, when it comes to those individual sports, we have different types of tournaments. The individual sports start with the regional, advance to the sectional and the state final. For example, cross country would be an example of that. Or for those sports where a regional may not be necessary, we just start with a sectional, advance to the state final. Track and field would be an example of that type of individual sport. In the team bracketed sports, we start with regionals in each classification, generally 32 sites conducting tournaments. The winners of those regionals advance to sectionals, of which we have 8 sites, super sectional, where we have 4 sites, and eventually to the state final tournament, where currently, in particular, our 4-class team bracketed sports, we're bringing 4 teams from each class to the state finals. There are some sports, because of numbers, that may not start at the regional level. And additionally, in boys volleyball, water polo, and dual team wrestling, we don't have a super sectional. They start at the sectional level and then advance directly to the state final. So just give you an overview of the type of sports and the funneling that we have in the different types of sports and tournaments. So in IHSA Policy 18, and this is really what drives us in how we go about assigning schools, and the Geographic Principle, which is in part of Policy 18, states, and I apologize for reading this, but it's important. It's an important principle to understand, to know how we go about our process. So in the history of our association, this has been its foundation, that the state series is designed to determine a state champion. And to that end, that means that the state series is not intended to necessarily advance the best teams in the state to the state final. So again, the geographic principle being that the membership, for the lifetime of the membership over 100 years, has been representation in an IHSA state final tournament should be determined on a geographic basis. And that is that schools advancing to the state final tournament should qualify from given geographical areas of the state, obviously trying to minimize travel as best we can. And therefore, the pairings for the state final tournament are determined every year in a drawing that we open up to the media and public, and typically have a media person come into our office and actually conduct that drawing. And again, that's once teams arrive to the state tournament. We don't, and haven't in our history, done much seeding at the state final level. That's generally by a random draw, with some exceptions. For example, in individual state wrestling, there is a seeding process to separate some wrestlers in those individual sports, much like we might do in track and field as they advance with times. We separate into heats those individuals that perform. But in the team bracketed sports, it's a random assignment at the state final tournament. Leading up to that, we allow for some seeding, and again, we'll talk about some of that. And finally, the number of schools in the state final tournament and the levels of competition in that state series are going to be determined by the number of schools that enter into that state series. And that's probably reflective as you look at the different types of sports, recognizing that not all schools offer all of the sports that we offer. And so that's a variance that is part of what we do. So here are the elements that factor into the assigning of schools at different levels of the tournament. First is the number of schools entered into the state series and their locations. The location makes up the geographic principle that we talked about. And then obviously the classification of schools in the state series is going to separate schools. And then in individual state series tournaments and meets, the number of schools with full teams assigned to the beginning competition, we try to balance that as much as possible, recognizing that as in individual tournaments, while there's a team aspect and some do enter fully teams, other schools may just enter individuals, one or two golfers as an example, as opposed to a team, and trying to balance that as best we can. A travel distance to the tournament and meet site could justify a possible imbalance in the number of schools assigned to a particular site. And again, we're going to talk about that balancing of numbers and the assigning of schools. So these are factors, and coaches often think that maybe we should use these as factor, but they're not. They're not part of Policy 18. And one is the won-loss records for the schools doesn't determine what sectional or regional schools might be assigned to. Now, seeding does use win-loss records when determining seeding, but not when we don't factor that into assigning. The strengths and or weaknesses of the schools in the geographic area are going to determine the splitting up into different geographic regions. The anticipated or potential revenue that we or schools might gain in assigning schools in a particular regional or sectional, again, not a factor. And the individual or private request of schools and their coaches to be moved or designated to one sectional over another is something we just don't entertain when we go about the assigning process. So We're going to look at four different examples that'll be mapping examples and kind of walk through the process that each sport administrator takes when they're working through the assignment process. So there in the upper right-hand corner is an example of what we would call blank map. It's a map with schools identified, abbreviated, of course, and their geographic area across the state. And so we start with this blank map with all the schools that are going to participate in a particular class of sport. And so it's electronic, and it's designed by Scott Johnson for us to then click on host schools that we've designated at different levels of tournaments. Those are highlighted in a little bolder, and you'll see that here in a second. But once those are indicated, then we start to assign schools simply by geography, and again, trying to balance the numbers. So we first start with the sectional assignments as it's indicated there, working backwards. The sectional starts first. And then our goal is to create a numerical balance, again, using the geography and trying to stay within 2 schools in each sectional to assure contest balance when it comes to the number of competitions a school would have to compete in and win to advance through a regional to a sectional and obviously possibly super sectional and then state. So the example here on the slide is, let's say this map had 171 schools, then we might create one sectional geographically that has 23 schools, one sectional that has 22 schools in it, and 6 sectionals that might have 21 schools. That might be one way to break it out. And again, geography might play with how we divide up those numbers. Or another option might be to have 4 sectionals with 22 teams, 3 sectionals with 21, and 1 with 20. Again, trying to stay within no more than a 2 schools differential from one sectional to the next. So we do assign a central placeholder, again, by geography. And then once we have those sectionals assigned, then we go back and review the data that's been provided to us on who is willing and able to host for a particular sport. Each completed map, because each administrator is sitting at a computer and drawing and pulling these schools into a sectional, has a human element to it. So that also plays a part in how a particular sport, regional, sectional, might be assigned geographically. So here's an example of a map of our schools that are drawn into 8 different sectionals. And so let's talk a little bit about how some sports have sectionals while others may involve some subsectionals, and it really has a lot to do with class and geography. So in Class 1A soccer and 1A and 2A and all of our other team bracketed sports, all state series will begin with a subsectional. That's part of policy, and again designed to try to minimize travel with recognizing that schools wanted more teams of possible division when it comes to seeding. And so within a particular subsectional, then the top 4 seeds are separated, and then the remaining schools are separated based on geography. And we'll get into that a little bit more in future slides. Then in our bigger schools, Class 2A, 3A soccer, and 3A and 4A and our other team bracketed sports, all of the state series shall begin with sectional complexes unless our administrators determine that within that sectional complex, the geography and travel requires the division into subsectionals, and then we start there. So true seeds, again, done by the schools, are used to populate the brackets of a sectional complex if a sectional stays in a sectional complex. So the map you're seeing here on the right would be one of our small school team bracketed sports. All of these sectionals would be separated into halves, subsectionals, and then the subsectionals would be seated accordingly, and then we would make assignments based upon that. So again, referring to the Class 2A basketball example that you're seeing here on the right, and I know it's a little small. Again, it's not for the purpose of knowing which schools are indicated there on the map, but you can see by the shading that this 2A basketball map has 8 sectional complexes, then divided into 2 subsectionals. And again, if you look closely, you can see in each one of those sectionals a little bolder identification of the school, and then some in a typical print. And it's with this administrator who prepared this map, that is how we designate on our map the difference in the 2 different subsectionals. And each one of those, again, you have to look rather closely, but there are divisions there of smaller case or lighter imprinted letters to represent schools versus a little bolder, and that's the 2 subsectionals divided. And then with each one of those subsectionals, we would work with a different map to then identify and pick schools. Excuse me, the regionals then are going to be determined based upon the seeds within the subsectional, and that's what we're noting here on this slide, is that when we get to the sectional semifinal round that contain the subsectionals, the regional from subsectional A containing the number 1 seed shall be paired with the regional of subsectional B containing the number 2 seed. Again, all of this language is in the policy. There's no reseeding when you get to the sectional. We simply pair these up according to this once the seeding is determined by the coaches, so that the regional that contains the number 1 seed would cross over and play the regional in the other subsectional that had the number 2 seed as the highest seed. If the number 1 seed would get upset in one regional, we don't reconfigure the matchups in this sectional. We do it with how we initiate it. But if regionals played out according to seed, then we would end up with the number 1 seed from one subsectional playing the number 2 in the first sectional semifinal, and then vice versa, a crossover of the number 1 subsectional seed would play the opposite number 2 subsectional seed, with the possibility of the number 1 subsectional seeds within the sectional possibly playing each other in the sectional championship. So in terms of assigning, again, another mapping example, in the upper right-hand corner there you have a basketball map. We split into 2 subsectionals, the 2 regionals per subsectional and T-bracketed sports. Again, trying to maintain a balance. If it's a 20-team sectional, then we're going to divide them equally, the subsectionals, so we end up with 4 regionals of 5. There are factors that could force that to be unbalanced, and there is some autonomy for administrators to choose, again, mainly by geography, how that might be divided. It is a tedious process, and there are some movements as we create these subsectionals to, maybe move one team into where the geography is close and see if that helps the balance of schools or helps the geography as we move across the map, creating these kind of spider webs of teams coming to a particular sectional. As we choose a host, we're looking for information that is presented to us from the school, their willingness to host, the ability to host, the different things that the facility might have available to host, and then if there's a history of success with the particular school, that factors in. But we do try to make sure that those who are willing to have the facilities to host get the opportunity over a period of years and move that around. Host sites do change the geography and travel, of course, depending upon the location of the host within the subsectional. That could change things, but we don't change assignments or the numbers to try to, again, create a balance and maintain that balance. So this is an example of an individual sport that would start at the sectional level. The goal when assigning for individual sports is to try to bring balance to the number of team entries as well as the individual entries assigned to each site. And again, if you look closely, there's a red number near the host site, and that's indicating the number of schools that are coming into that particular regional. So in nearly every one of these sectionals, it looks like there's 22 teams, with the exception of the sectional in Chicago. It looks like it might have 21. So the administrator here has done a nice job of balancing the number of teams, assuming that the individual entries are kind of matched with the team entries. This is a balanced map. Again, anomalies will exist where a certain geographic area will contain more individuals than teams. And so, again, that could modify when you first just glance at a posting of the number of teams in a sectional and individual sports, where there may be a difference of 4 or 5 schools. That's likely a result of a number of schools in that sectional that has more teams in it, that they have more individual entries than team entries. And finally, we do have some outlier and exceptions when we look at a map based upon team entries. Here's an example of likely a water polo map. And so this sport, real close in proximity geographic area, we still separate into sectionals. And while there are less schools there, it's still not easy or less controversial. The geography actually is a lot tighter. And so from the school side, there oftentimes is arguments about how we should do more to separate the quality of programs into different sectionals. But again, the geographic principle doesn't allow us to do that. So we simply work off of geography and proximity of schools. As we near the end of this webinar, I'll just talk briefly about football, and recognizing that what I'm going to talk about here is how we're working for the next 2 years, next 2 football seasons, and recognizing in the 21-22 school year, we've had an agreement from the membership to move into a districting model, and I won't likely spend a lot of time with that because that's new and a lot of things to be determined on that. But for the next 2 years in football, our postseason does require a qualification. So not all football playing schools are eligible for the playoffs. You have to qualify, and the numbers are there. We have 256 qualifiers. There are 8 classes, which makes 32 teams per class. The classifications aren't determined to the end of the year till we know which schools have qualified. And then there are divisions of these 32 teams per class by enrollment. Classes 1A through 6A have a division geographically. We do a similar kind of mapping with those classes into 2 groups of 16. They're paired according to their seeds. And then in class 7A and 8A, because of generally the proximity of schools and those classification being much closer, our board approved that those classes would be paired according to true seeds. So 1 through 32 is how they're seeded to initiate the first round of the football playoffs. In football, you may or may not be aware that and as part of that qualification, if you get 6 wins, you do qualify for the playoffs. Some 5 and 4 teams qualified just to get us to our 256 qualifiers for the football playoffs. We use tiebreakers for the qualifiers. The first tiebreaker is the combined total of all 9 opponents' wins. Again, opponents' wins during the regular season. So if you were 5 and 4 and we calculate the total wins of your opponents, that first criteria would determine whether or not you qualify. And then if there's a tie at that point for the 256th qualifier, then we move to the second tiebreaker, which is the combined total victories from the 5 teams that your school defeated. So not all opponents, but just your defeated opponents determine a number, total wins of those teams that make up that second tiebreaker that hopefully breaks ties. And the terms and conditions of football have the other mechanisms of which that breakout, and we would divide those schools up. The final tiebreaker would be a flip of a coin for the qualifier, and while that doesn't happen often, there is schools at times end up, and we've had years of which that 256 qualifier does require a coin flip, and one school's in, one school's out. So just covering a couple quick questions that we often get. Why am I a different sectional for softball than I am for volleyball? Generally, that's because some schools offer softball and others don't offer volleyball. This question will likely become cleaner as we move to the next 2-year classification cycle, and that all schools per enrollments will qualify, will be in the same classification. And so I think it's likely that it's more often that sectionals will look more alike than they have in the past. But again, there are separate administrators working on the map, and that could cause teams to be in different sectionals. Question: I want to schedule teams for my sectional during the regular season. Will the group of schools I'm assigned with change from year to year? And I would say in the past, yes, but in our 2-year classification cycle, I think that's going to be much less. And depending upon, again, hosts, sites, and locations, I think schools can count on during that 2-year cycle, schools having and being able to schedule in the regular season more of their likely opponents that will be in the same sectional. And then the variance of, when you travel, you may go 1 year north for both your regional and your sectional, but then the following year you go south. Again, this is, just things changing on the map, schools dropping a program or adding a program. But the 2-year cycle that we have will create more consistency again with heading in the same direction, likely from within the 2-year cycle, 1 year to the next. Presently in the seeding process, we do conduct all seeding online, records, rankings, and other information. Obviously, we encourage coaches to take into account, but the coaches are conducting the seeding, and it's really at their discretion to use what method they choose to. We've provided some general guidelines in the terms and conditions as to how we expect them to seed, but at this point, it's really a coach's decision. Seeded, again, in our 1A, 2A sports, there are subsectional seeding, and each subsectional would seed themselves accordingly. And then in classes 3A and 4A, in the Chicago suburban area, we allow all those tournaments to be sectional complexes. And then outside of that area, a sectional complex is going to be, whether that drops to a subsectional is going to be based upon geography, as I talked about earlier. Real quickly, in terms of officials assigning, that's not part of the geographic principle, but it is part of what we do here in each sport. We use a power rating, and you see there the different pieces that make up the power rating for a particular official, but they're assigned by geography, and then just based upon this power rating level, the higher the power rating, the more likely that official is going to advance deeper into the state series. But the licensing level, there are 3 different levels of licensing that officials can qualify for. They annually take an exam score that factors in to a rating of which they receive. And then based upon their previous state series experience, they earn a different point value towards their rating. We've often and continue to ask for ratings by coaches, no longer by officials, but the ratings will factor into a percentage that will determine a point structure in the power rating. A top 15 list that officials arrive on because of schools and assigners putting them on will give them a percentage, factors into a power rating point. And then the attendance frequency of them to our sport clinics that are offered annually gives them a point value. And then if they've worked a certain number of varsity games, they get different levels of points. So that total point value identifies an official by their power rating, and that's used by our administrators along with their geographic location to be assigned to a regional, a sectional, and future advancement during the state series. So I hope that gives you a brief overview of the assigning, how we go about assigning and grouping teams in the state series. Again, I'll stay on here, and as you have questions, feel free to put those in front of us. But we know your day is busy. We just appreciate the short time you may have spent with us today, and look forward to you attending future months webinars. We'll have another one in February. And again, appreciate your time and taking the time to be a part of this webinar today. Thanks very much. Steve, I see your question there about districting, and there's a lot of factors that'll play into schools and the district they're assigned. And the way we have it set up, it's going to be based upon obviously enrollment, but then on the private schools, there's a success factor, and then the multiplier waiver that schools may or may not have leading into the 2021 football season. So the final districting won't be established until December of 2020. However, I would share with you that at a board meeting yesterday, members of our board felt like it may be good for the membership to see a preliminary outlook of what football district assignments might look like. And as we talked, it was important. And if we do this, and we're going to have more discussion with the board in future months, we have to make sure all schools recognize it is totally preliminary. And it would just be, if we put something out, it would just be a first look at a preliminary example of districts that we obviously didn't put out prior to the vote, but now may, just to help answer the question you have presented here, for schools to get a feel for some possibly geographically located schools in their area that would likely, by enrollment, be assigned to their district, so they could look in other directions for selecting those first two non-district games. So we're going to put this together and put it in front of our board in February or March, as time allows, and then maybe this summer or leading into the spring or during the spring, possibly get out a preliminary view of what the districts might look like. Again, emphasizing, and I can't overemphasize it enough, as it just being a preliminary district rough draft. And so I appreciate your point that it would benefit athletic directors and coaches and for scheduling purposes. And that would be the sole purpose for us doing it, is to just, establish a bit of an idea for schools where they might find themselves. But again, recognizing, depending upon where they fall in the enrollment of the class they're assigned, you might be on the border where somebody gets multiplied or success factored, and then that could move a school into a totally different district because of them moving into a different class. But that's just the risk you take. But again, I appreciate your point, and we are looking into the possibility of a preliminary district posting soon. So I just add that. Also, this is being recorded. It was recorded and will be available in the resources section under video, the resources tab, video. You'll be able to go back and if others that, as you talk to others about the presentation, they want to see any of the presentations we've done, that's a location that people can go, and other administrators or coaches could go and find these webinars. But Steve, thanks for the question, and I hope that lets you know that we as a staff are looking into and we'll be working with our board on the possibilities. Yeah. Seeing no other questions coming, we're just going to go ahead and shut down the webinar. And again, we appreciate your attendance and hope you'll have a successful remainder to your school year, and especially your winter sports that are continuing, and best of luck in the postseason.